Hello and welcome to the Small Business Briefing. I'm Brian Calley, CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Sarah Miller, Vice President of Operations at SBAM. Thanks for joining us today. We like to start off welcoming one of our newest members, and today we're welcoming Stallworth HVAC out of Detroit with owner Willie Stallworth. Thanks for joining. All right, some pretty exciting news to start off the show today, Brian, and that is that legislation for association health plans passed the Senate unanimously late last week.
Yeah, this is a big deal. We've been talking about it. We did a call to action recently. We had a lot of our members participate, reach out to their senator to support the passage of this legislation. So it got introduced, it went through the Senate committee where it passed without any no votes, and then it passed unanimously through the entire Senate. What that means, every Republican, every Democrat who was at least present, there were 35 there that day of 38, all voted in favor, which is huge. Great for the prospects of the bill moving forward. So what does this legislation do? Just as a reminder, it allows for small businesses across multiple industries to band together to create their own insurance risk pools. This under the same type of framework and guidelines that big companies that self-insure do. And this gives negotiation power through size. It gives the ability to do some plan design, and it makes it so that those that are in that risk pool aren't paying for anybody else's risk. They're only paying for their own risk. And what that means is that when they do health and wellness initiatives, when they can make a difference in the practices of their own workforces that are involved in these types of plans, it can bring down the rates. And that's different from how insurance off the rack works. If a small business is really successful in wellness initiatives among their workforce, there is no benefit directly to them in terms of insurance rates. And so this makes those three big changes, but there's an added benefit that was included in the Senate version, which was to offer catastrophic backstop coverage to these types of pools. And what that means is that bigger losses over a certain amount would be covered by a state-supported reinsurance policy, and that will make a difference in premium cost too. So this doesn't solve every problem when it comes to health insurance, but it will make a very big difference in resetting some of the baseline and giving some tools in the toolbox that small businesses desperately need. We couldn't be happier that not only that it passed and moved forward, but that it did so with a unanimous vote.
All right, yes, definitely good news. One we're happy to celebrate with you all today.
Oh,
All
one
right.
more thing, by the
Oh,
way, just to make clear. So it passed through the Senate. Now it has to go through the House. There's similar legislation being introduced in the House as well. And so I expect what'll happen is that sometime this year there'll be a House version, and then they'll have to work out differences between the two. So while this is good news, it doesn't mean that it's a done deal or it's on its way to the governor's desk for signature right now. It means that it just passed through one chamber, but it passed strong enough. It gives us a lot of confidence that there's something really uh, that has a great shot at making it to the finish line.
yep. Step one, you have to start somewhere, right? We'll keep everybody up to date as we know more. All right, let's do some legislative updates, starting with the budget. There have been some targets that have been agreed to within the legislature. So, what are we looking at for small business related line items?
Yeah, so it seems like the budget is moving faster than it did last year. Last year, it didn't get finalized until late September or early morning October 1st, and so this is a lot earlier than before. The targets agreed to means that the House and the Senate and the governor agreed how much each of the individual budgets will get to work with, and then they have to fill in the line items. So some of the things that we're looking for or looking at is for small business services to be beefed up in the MEDC with more of a focus on second stage companies. So existing well-established companies in Michigan being our best bet for the future. And then that without neglecting startups, of course, but it's just second stage companies are they are the plurality of employment in Michigan, so critical and important. We like pure Michigan funding is as well. There's several workforce development and training initiatives within the budget in addition to some of our key focuses in economic development. So this is it's a good sign that it's moving earlier. We think that it seems fairly likely that there'll be a pre-July 4th or 4th of July budget. And of course, nothing's guaranteed, but just kind of the way, kind of the vibe, if you will, as things are moving through the process, looks more likely than not.
All right, let's talk about WorkShare. The Unemployment Insurance Agency announced an enhancement to WorkShare. So, what are the potential benefits for small businesses?
Yeah, this is think of it as like partial unemployment. So oftentimes or historically, people have thought of unemployment as being an all or nothing. You lay somebody off and then they qualify for unemployment. But exists because there are circumstances where maybe it's a person doesn't need to be fully laid off, but there's a reduction in hours. And if you are in that situation where it makes sense for you to reduce hours, but you don't want to let people go, they can qualify, or there's an expanded group that can now qualify for partial unemployment. So it's a matter of how much you lay people off. It used to be they're changing it. See, it was 15 to 45%. So you could reduce hours by 15% all the way to 45%. And in that range is where a person could qualify for partial unemployment. That's changing from now as few as 10% of hours reduction all the way to 60%. And here's how it would work. So let's say that you've got somebody who's making $1,000 a week. And you're going to, in just the scenario or the situation of your business, you have to reduce those hours by 50%. So you're going to take them down to 500 instead of 1,000, and they're going to work half of the time. You can now participate in WorkShare where the person then can be on unemployment and get 50% of the benefit on unemployment. And it's not going to make up their whole lost wages, but it makes up some of that difference. And so depending on how much the employee is making, it will have a lot to say for whether or not the proportion of unemployment how much of the unemployment will make up. But it's the idea of reduction of hours and partial unemployment can be a win-win for both the employee and the employer, especially when you just don't want to lose touch with that employee. You don't really want to let them go, but there just isn't the cash flow or the work at the moment to support their full-time work. So a great option. It's one that was made available very, very widely during the pandemic. And so it's been a part of the system, but this range at which you can use it. So you can reduce hours as few as 10% and qualify to participate, and all the way up to 60% and qualify to participate. Now, if you do less than 10% reduction in hours, you can't qualify for WorkShare. The employee can't qualify for WorkShare. If it's more than 60%, they're just going to be able to, that's a point where they consider that to be more, it's at that point more than half, well over half unemployed. So it's outside of the WorkShare spirit as well. So we do have an article on this in our most recent newsletter. So I would encourage people to take a look at sbm.org or check your email if you're a member. Hopefully, or if you're watching this, you're probably a member. Check your email. There's a great rundown of the WorkShare program.
All right, let's move on to TriShare. So, TriShare codification passed the Michigan House last week. Can you remind everybody what TriShare is and why small businesses should care?
This has to do with childcare. And about 5 years ago, it was launched as a pilot where it was rather than having just a subsidy for some employees to go out and buy health insurance, the idea was to create a three-way sharing arrangement between the employee, the employer, and the state to make childcare availability and affordability greater. And that has been steadily growing over the course of the last 5 years. And as it has expanded, there's been more support that has grown. It's still not utilized as often as it certainly could be. A lot of people have still never heard about it. But this legislation that has moved out of the House and is heading over to the Senate now is one that would codify the program so it no longer be a pilot, but be a permanent offering, and or as permanent as anything in legislation could be, I suppose. But the idea that it would move beyond that trial stage and now be a regular offering. And we do think that'll make some difference in the number of entities that choose to participate. When it's a pilot, if you get into something, you get used to it, and maybe it's not going to last. And so participation may have been reduced because of that. But we think there's a pretty good chance that that this will, once it passes through, which I think it will, once this passes through the whole process and becomes permanent, that it'll be a pretty big incentive for people to give it a serious look.
All right, let's move to the federal level. Last week, we covered the most recent inflation news. So Brian, what are the implications and expectations now around interest rates?
Yeah, so there is a new Kevin Warsh, the new chair of the Federal Reserve. So there is a new chair. So there was some speculation. How would the posture of the Federal Reserve change? And really, there hasn't been any huge changes or policy changes. And partly this is because inflation is up. So the headline inflation is certainly higher, which ties into energy especially. But even when you take that out, the core inflation number is rising at an uncomfortable rate as well. Not out of control, not like it was immediately post-pandemic, but still higher than the target, or well off the target that the policymakers look for. And so while there was, when we started this year, there was kind of an expectation that there would be rate cuts this year, that the interest rate, the overnight borrowing rates that banks are charged, that ties into what businesses are charged when you borrow as well. And if you have a line of credit and it's tied to prime rate, for example, there's a couple of stages of separation, but that really is what drives the prime rate up and down. And so there was an expectation earlier this year that there would be a couple of rate cuts this year, but this is several meetings in a row where they've kept them the same. And there was a few points that were made. Economic activity expanding at a solid pace. Solid pace was the term that was used in the press conference. Strong productivity growth and capital investment, stable labor market, job gains keeping pace with workforce growth. Unemployment rate is little changed, and then inflation remains higher. So status quo. But if you look at some of the expectations moving forward, there are some folks that are starting to price in a rate increase. I'm skeptical that a rate increase will seriously be on the table, but I think a majority of the governors on the Federal Reserve do believe that that's a possibility this year. So that it might be necessary this year. And so what happens with inflation will have a lot to say about that, and what happens, of course, with the labor market in tandem with it. So far, status quo, but I would say that hopes for a rate cut anytime soon have dwindled to zero.
All right, let's talk now about Election Watch 2026. So after the briefing last week, there was a pretty big development in the Republican primary for governor. What happened?
The president made an endorsement. So this was something that there was a lot of speculation on over the course of many months that this Republican primary has been underway. There were 4 candidates that were still in the race at the time when he made this endorsement. And the endorsement was for John James, member of Congress in the 10th Congressional District. So John James, who has been endorsed twice before by the president in other statewide elections for Senate, when he ran against Stabenow one time and against Peters another time, and then of course in his congressional races since then. The This election is a big deal. So it's not the like a golden ticket like it was before, where in previous election cycles, it seems like anybody got this election or got that endorsement, won the primary. Um, it still makes it likely, but there have been other primaries around the country where it hasn't gone the way of the presidential endorsement. So, but this is a very, very big deal. Now, what happened with the other candidates then? Eric Nesbitt, state senator and the minority leader in the state senate, did immediately, like within a half an hour, dropped out of the race and endorsed John James. So um, at that point, his the chances of him winning the primary, the calendar was short, wasn't enough money for him to get his name out there, and so he made a pretty logical move to exit the race and endorse who is widely considered the front runner, especially with the president's endorsement in a Republican primary. But businessman Perry Johnson is staying in the race, as is Mike Cox, and so there is still an active race. There hasn't been any polling since then, it's just last week. So, but I would expect that before too long, we will see some polling and see what type of difference that it makes. But at this point, it is still a three-way race.
All right, so it is still a three-way race for the Republicans. Bridge, Michigan did publish an article about election spending so far. What stuck out to you there?
Yeah, the top line number is the main thing that stuck out to me, that they said that that gubernatorial candidates um, and then also outside groups. So there's the candidates themselves and then political action committees and other organizations that spend on behalf of those candidates have spent more than $50 million in advertising already this year. We're just talking about the gubernatorial candidates. That's it, not all the other elections that are happening at the same time. And so 50 million is quite a bit. Now, looking at the totals, 23.2 million was from Perry Johnson. So that's almost half of the total. And then John James, he has directly spent about 1.5 million. But there's a super PAC called Mission Michigan that spent about $4 million on his behalf. And then you've also got Mike Cox, who put in pretty significant personal resources as well, not as much as Perry Johnson, of course, but has a multi-million-dollar effort ongoing also. So big spending on the Republican side. That's why it makes the stakes of the president's endorsement so high in this election. And I do expect that we'll get the next time we see some polling, though, we'll see whether or not the spending is moving numbers much, and what sort of force the president's endorsement has in that primary.
And speaking of endorsements, the Detroit News issued an endorsement to Sheriff Swanson in the Democratic primary for governor, which was kind of a surprising development in an otherwise apparent consolidation around Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson.
Yeah, this one was a bit of a surprise because sometimes the Detroit News and the Free Press, for that matter, when there's an election that seems kind of lopsided, they'll find a way to endorse the one that they know is going to win. In this case, they decided not to. Now, to be clear, the Detroit News is not the endorsement page that most Democrats would look to for recommendations on how they vote. So it's more the conservative newspaper, and the Free Press, the one that Democrats would more lean toward. So so it was a little surprising, but I think the other consolidation that is happening behind Jocelyn Benson is really turning into quite a force. AFL-CIO, for example, was the most recent, I think, that came on board. And so very large union, that type of support in a Democratic primary is huge. And I do expect that she's in a position where she'll run away with that nomination, and win by quite a margin. On the Republican side, I think the very first time we see that first poll, it'll give us an idea of whether or not this James will extend his lead like he started the election with, or if it'll be closer like recent polls have shown the three leading candidates relatively close to where it's a pretty interesting election.
Right, and let's continue with the US Senate race. Excuse me. The primary on the Democratic side really does appear to be perhaps the most intensely watched primary in the country. What do you think makes it so intriguing?
This is so Michigan's a battleground state and it's watched every election. So that part's not new. But even among the races that are being watched, this one, the Democratic primary in Michigan for U.S. Senate has really captured a lot of attention from all over the country and especially in Washington, D.C. And the Senate is up for grabs. It was Republicans have a majority there. It was thought almost unfathomable that that Democrats would take control of the Senate in this cycle. Just odds were kind of stacked against them, but the unpopularity of the president has created a situation where Democrats really think that they can take it, that they could be competitive in places like Maine, where which is a left-leaning state, but Senator Collins has a lot of electoral success there. Or they think they have a shot at winning in Ohio. Again, would be a very surprising development. But all of those hopes of taking the Senate evaporate if they can't hold in Michigan. If you remember, Senator Gary Peters is retiring this year. And so it is an open seat, and they need to hold that seat in order to even have a shot at taking the majority. So the stakes are high in the first place, but it also is demonstrating kind of a rift that has developed within the party. We've talked a lot about the rifts, multiple rifts within the Republican Party over the course of the last several election cycles, but that has started to happen within and among the Democrats as well. And Abdul Al-Sayed is kind of an insurgent type candidate that has in some polls is showing in first place and really close with Mallory Mc or with Haley Stevens, a member of Congress, and then Mallory McMorrow's numbers have really they're hard to nail down because they've been kind of all over the map, but they're all spending big, and it is kind of morphing into this election on like who controls that party. And this is somewhat of a bellwether on which part of the internal factions, the more kind of um, traditional platform and candidate like a Haley Stevens, or a more kind of insurgent candidate like Abdul Al-Sayed. That is it's an interesting bellwether for the party, and it's an indication of what's happening politically across the whole country, where a lot of the rules, it seems like the rule books in politics have been thrown out, and all the things that you think are givens are are no longer givens, and so it makes these elections more exciting, but also more unpredictable to know what is going to happen. So Michigan's at the center of it, and this race, I think when that we talked about the spending on the Republican side of the gubernatorial election, the U.S. Senate spending between now and the election, I think, is going to be enormous as well, between now and the primary. And so we will, of course, update as we get closer and closer to that election. But coming up in early August, it'll all be settled. The candidates for both major parties will be established for November at that time, and we'll be here informing you right along the way.
We sure will. That's all the show that we have for you today. We appreciate you tuning in. Have a wonderful week, and we will be back here next Monday at 3 o'clock.
See you next time.